Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Mind Matters. If you tuned in to our show last week, one of the books we mentioned that we've been reading this year is The Origin of the World's Mythologies by E.J. Michael Witzel. So we're going to be talking about this today because we've all been checking it out recently. And like I said in the show last week, it is quite the revolutionary book. Like, if you're into mythology at all, comparative mythology, like if you've read anything by like Mircea Eliade or Joseph Campbell, or even if you're just into myths, even in fiction, like, if you're a Neil Gaiman fan, Gaiman's really into mythology. One of his recent books is actually his own retelling of the Norse mythology. I mean, if you like superhero movies, if you like Marvel, if you like Thor and that kind of stuff, like this is where all that stuff comes from. So this book has the ambitious goal of tracing the world's mythologies back through time. So again, like I mentioned last week, his methodology is basically and his argument is to say that it is possible, and he'd argue that he has done this, possible to trace back mythologies in the same way that we can trace back languages, as well as even genetics, and like using those sciences and archaeology, paleoanthropology, all these things, we can trace back human movements, for instance, and the spreading of languages and the kind of morphing and growth of languages. So we can look at for instance, the Indo-European languages, trace back the similarities, like and using these analytic techniques, look at like the branching points and saying like, okay, well, these three languages are connected in these ways, and these three are connected in these ways, and then before that they were the same, and then that language family is connected to this language family, and they all trace back to like a Proto-Indo-European, for instance. Well, he's arguing that the same thing can be done with mythologies. You look at one mythology and you look at its overall narrative, its overall storyline. You compare. So you've got the overall storyline, and then you've got the individual, what he calls mythemes. So these little mythic units. It might just be like, the first human being born from a tree or being made out of clay, or some bird doing some crazy thing. Whatever it is, there's an identifiable unit in that myth. You can look at groups of these in one modern location, and then compare that to related groups and related mythologies, look at the similarities, and then do exactly the same thing with languages, trace it back to a kind of a common ancestor. Again, that's where the comparison with genetics comes in. He's basically tracing back and looking for the shared, the common ancestors for these different mythologies. And he comes to some interesting conclusions. Now, one of the things that I don't, that he doesn't, he doesn't belabor the point, but one of the things that I found about this, it says something about like the nature of human creativity. Now we'll get into some of the details in the book, but I just want to make this point. Something about the nature of creativity and the way that humans kind of make, tell stories and make art too. He makes reference to music too. Like you can theoretically do the same thing with musical styles, and because if you compare different world musics, you'll find that some cultures will use primarily like a pentatonic scale, like in East Asia, and then you have like our Western 12-note scale, and then but if you go to like places like in India, you'll get like a 24-note scale. They have like microtones, and so theoretically you could trace those back and kind of come up with this proto world music that might have shared characteristics. Of course, that's going to be way more difficult than it is to do with mythology, so it might not even be possible, but it's at least theoretically possible. And like being a musician myself, I think of one of the things that always has like just made me shake my head is all these copyright lawsuits. And of course, like on YouTube, YouTube is the worst for copyright claims because like a creator will make a video. Let's say it's like a 20-minute video. It might even be like a musical analysis video where they're looking at a piece of music and then taking it apart, like for educational purposes. This is the kind of stuff that my professors would do in college when I was taking courses about music theory. Take a piece of music and kind of like analyze it, and this video will then get claimed by the copyright owner for that. Like it might be 5-10 seconds of this song. and then all the ad revenue from that video will then go to this copyright claimant, even though their copyrighted material is being used for like 5 to 10 seconds out of this 20-minute video that has all kinds of other content, and I mean, it should be fair use. That's one kind of this copyright claim hysteria. The other is actual artists suing other artists for like stealing their songs. Of course, there are some famous examples like, was it MC Hammer ripping off Queen? Dun, dun, dun. I can't even hum it.
Vanilla Ice.
Yeah, oh, it's Vanilla Ice, right? Yeah, Vanilla Ice and Queen. Yeah, he totally ripped off that bass line and was like, oh, well, it's different because I just added that one note. Sure, he ripped it off, but should, I think copyright claims like that are just totally bogus. I think people should be totally free to rip each other off however much they want, because arguably that has been the history of like art and of all kinds of artistic creations. Even from painting, looking at a theme, looking at a particular style or subject, and then doing it in a new style, obviously influenced by someone else, someone that they've been studying. Music, I mean, I'd argue that the vast majority of music is ripped off in some way. First of all, the vast majority of like #1 hits use the same chord progression, just because the studio executives have realized that that chord progression makes hits, even though historically those hits with that chord progression have been like in the minority of songs. Like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there were all kinds of different chord progressions that made hits. Like #1, like the Beatles, only one of their #1 hits uses the particular chord progression that all the songs are using these days. But so you've got all kinds of lawsuits going on right now, like Radiohead and their first hit, Creep. They got sued for ripping off this other song, like using the chord progression from that. So they had to give part of their royalties to this other guy that wrote a song that sounded like that. And now Radiohead is suing, I believe, Lana Del Rey or someone for ripping off Creep, the song that they ripped off from someone else. And it's just this, circle of suing each other for these copyright claims when like the art should be, like artists should be, I think, free to rip off as much as they want, like I said, because that's historically how things have happened. And even like classical musicians, you look at some famous classical pieces, a lot of those melodies came from like folk songs. So they just they hear a good melody and say, oh, I can do something with that. I can do something better with that. I can take that and I can do better. So if you think that you can write a better song than some famous person, and you actually do a good job and people like it, then good on you. Now, the thing about that is that there's, like I said, there's precedent, at least in music, and there's precedent in mythology. This is one of the big points in this book, is that pretty much everyone was copying everyone else. And the only way we'd be able to do this science, for instance, and this comparative mythology and tracking back mythologies, is because all the people writing these mythologies were either ripping someone off. Well, now I'll say I've been using that phrase, ripping off, but it's not really it's not really ripping off. It's just that's just the way things work. Like that's the way that's the way any kind of creativity works. It's taking an idea and then just like morphing it and transforming it. And whether you get that idea like out of nowhere in your mind, or you've heard something and you've forgotten about it and you kind of recreate it in your mind and do something else with it, that's the way it works. With mythologies, what he's arguing is that he's going against certain traditional ways of looking at mythologies and explaining the commonalities. So, one way of doing this, one hypothesis has been that the similarities between mythologies have been the result of what he calls diffusion. So basically, one mythology diffuses into another culture and then it gets adopted by that culture. And so that's kind of like a horizontal transfer, like from this group living now to this group living now. And so now you've got two groups with a similar mythology. Now that diffused mythology might change a bit in the process. It might acquire certain features that were like local to that culture that acquired the new mythology, and so it'll gain a different flavor to it. So now when you're comparing those mythologies, they'll be slightly different. They'll have similarities, but there will be difference differences that are specific to the local culture that has preserved their own traditions and inserted them in some way. What he's arguing is that that might happen sometimes, and it does happen sometimes. Like the spread of, for instance, like Christian missionaries all over the world has injected a lot of biblical themes into the local culture, which have then been adopted and adapted for those specific cultures. But what he's arguing is that there's that overall the main explanation for a lot of these similarities is a common origin. So it's not that one culture is kind of spreading their mythology to another one. It's that the ancestors to both mythologies had the same mythology, and as they developed over the years and the generations, they might have acquired just local features, just as in like languages. That's why languages can be related but different. And so that the history of like stories, the history of human stories, has been one of like reworking what was in your past. In essence, you're copying your own past, and essentially that's what musicians are doing today, because most musicians copying each other are in the same culture. They've got the same. They're growing music in the same soil. It's like that is their soil. The songs that we've heard throughout our our childhoods and our young adulthoods, those are our own culture, right? So to develop them and to do something new with them is totally natural. And it's just the kind of the total corporatization and commodification of music that has led to this, the ridiculous things about copyright law. But really it is a grand human tradition, and it is and it's luckily, because of that, we can learn something about history. It's just like in genetics. Like David Reich, I mentioned his book. It was one of my favorite books last year, Who We Are and How We Got There, on the relatively recent study of ancient DNA. Because previously it just wasn't available. We had no means of doing like really good extraction and analysis of ancient DNA. We just didn't have the technology. Now it's like 1 million times cheaper than it was when the technology first developed. So it can be done all over the place. And there's this special feature. I was listening to an interview with Reich, and he pointed out that the only reason they're able to do this is because bones get preserved in such a way that bone material will preserve this DNA. All of the flesh and the soft tissue, where you'd think the most DNA would be, that degrades. But when you just have bones, because of a very special feature of bone, I can't remember what the chemical molecular property is, it preserves DNA. Without that, we would not be able to study ancient DNA and to get an idea of these population migrations and all these things. So it's like the same thing with, or a similar thing with mythology. It's like, thanks to the human propensity for like a conservative but progressive changing of the past, we are able to look deep into the past and come to some conclusions about what that past was like. Whereas just on the surface of things, you'd think that's impossible. And some people do think it's impossible, because writing is only 5,000-6,000 years old. And myths, the reason we have myths, if they're not transmitted orally and aren't alive today in that sense, is the only way we're able to do that is through writing, finding ancient tablets and manuscripts and being able to read what these people wrote down in their time. But because of these similarities and the ability to compare these things in a kind of tree-like diagram, like a tree of life, or like you see in evolutionary studies. Because of that, we're then able to get at least a hypothesis of what these ancient myths were like prior to 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. And what Witzel argues is that we're able to do this going back as far back as human history can go, and as far back as we can think about history, the history of humanity. So back to so-called the mitochondrial Eve, which is the most common female ancestor for all humanity, the last common ancestor for mitochondrial DNA. But then through the the first migrations of humanity into Eurasia and into Australia, and so along the South Asia, India, Southeast Asia into Australia, these first migrations and the migrations up into Asia, Central Asia, Europe. What Witzel, like the conclusion that he came to by comparing all these myths, I'll give his overall theory in a nutshell, is that he identified kind of two regions and two overarching similar myth structures. The first being found in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Andaman Islands, off the coast of Southeast Asia, between India and Southeast Asia, and then in Papua and Australia and Tasmania, the island off Southeast Australia, and all of these regions, despite their geographic spread, share similar myths. Let's just put it that way. But then, if you look everywhere else in the world, in Eurasia, North and South America, there are some similarities with those myths, but there is something new that only kind of those northern regions share, and that is an overall storyline. He calls it the first novel. So it's a story from the beginning of creation until the final end, the final destruction, the end of creation. And he gets into the features of it, but those features are shared by the mythologies of all those peoples and cultures. So from the collected myths in Japan to the Eddas in Norse mythology, and the Iranian mythologies, and the Near Eastern mythologies, so from Mesopotamia up through even including the Bible, and how all of these, and the Greek mythology, of course, Greek and Roman, and how all of these myths, in India, of course, all of these mythologies, they share an overall storyline. And so while if you find one detail that's shared between a whole bunch of cultures, if it's just a small detail, then you can't come to too firm a conclusion about just one small detail. But if you find an entire sequence of details, very specific, which essentially forms its own storyline, and then you find it everywhere, essentially, that, he argues, is a sign that they all came from an original storyline, and that this spread, historically, and that because of its extensive, geographic spread, it must have come before the peopling of the North Americas, or of the Americas. So before the first humans inhabited North and South America, and it must come, before the split between the Europeans and the Asians. There must been a common origin for this mythological storyline, and that is kind of the overall argument that he makes. And it's a thick book. What he does is basically, he's really, he probably, I guess, even kind of goes a bit overboard in proving his case, but he goes through all the features of what he calls the Laurasian storyline. That's the northern, the Eurasian storyline, in distinction to the Gondwana storyline, which is kind of the southern, South African, Southeast Asia, mostly Australian mythology, and then gets into all of the supporting evidence for that. So from linguistics, physical anthropology, genetics, archaeology, and then goes from there. So a ton of details, a ton of examples from just tons of world mythologies. So that's why I said if mythology interests you at all, it's very interesting, and there's a ton of sources to go and so you can go and read these myths if you're into that kind of thing. But yeah, very cool in that sense.
Well, I haven't gotten as far as I would have liked into the book yet, but there are several features of it that are really impressive. The first, as you were saying, Harrison, is that unlike a lot of other books that discuss mythology, Fraser and Joseph Campbell being an Iliad, as you mentioned, what he's attempting to do in his comparative mythological approach is to go back tens of thousands of years. Mm-hmm. So he quite often, draws on dates from 50,000 BC to 100,000 BC, and it just gives you, for a number of reasons, a kind of sense of the scope of his investigation. I'm not steeped in mythological research or background, but one of the most fascinating things about it is how he is able to look at the approaches of a Joseph Campbell, who many people have read The Power of Myth and have seen his programs, and that might be the extent to which they have come to appreciate the value and the tradition of mythology. And what he's able to do is he's able to narrow in on the work of a Joseph Campbell or Claude Lévi-Strauss, and he's able to say, that's all well and good, but look at how limited it is, and how limiting it is in approaching how much more we're capable of learning and thinking about mythology. And he does this with several different schools of thought that I was unfamiliar with up until starting to read Witzel's book. Another thing that he brings up in his writing is that we've come to think of the works of Jung as a kind of predecessor of Joseph Campbell, and the thinking of the archetypes and the myths contained within archetypes as this kind of universal kind of psychodynamic or psychic mythology that's inherent in every human being. And Witzel says no. It may exist among a certain portion of the world's population, but it's certainly not comprehensive, and it certainly doesn't account for many other types of ideas that come up when you look at mythology more closely, and that go far beyond the past few thousand years. So that was also fascinating. And what else is there? I mean, there are so many. I mean, that this is if you're not used to a dense kind of academic, it's readable certainly, but he's throwing out so many concepts and ideas of what someone who has been studying mythology and has lived mythology for so many decades. This is you're entering his world effectively, and it does take a little time and patience to get to understand what he's driving at. And even early on in the book, he promises to not only discuss or get to why an examination or the use of comparative mythology, which is, as he defines it, the kind of, it's a historical, it's a geographical, it's a comprehensive look at mythology, incorporating all of these different types of analysis, which he explains gives us a much fuller, broader view of the world's mythology, and promises, I haven't gotten to the end of the book yet, but promises to kind of get to the meaning and the purpose of these mythologies. So I'm looking forward to continuing to read this and appreciate where he's coming from and just how much research and erudition Witzel has. I've never read anything like it before. I'm looking forward to seeing where it all goes.
Well, I think I mentioned the kind of storylines. I think I'll, just for the sake of our readers, I'll give the overall structure for these stories. first, just to back up and expand on what he's saying with this whole common origin thing, he's arguing that if you go back far enough, you'll find one mythology, essentially. Like, if you go back far enough, you'll find a mythology that he calls Pangean. So this would be like the first mythology shared by, all the groups, I guess, that have contributed something to the history of mythology that survives in some way, or has survived in a manner in which we can then know part of it. So I guess hypothetically, it's possible that there were other myths that kind of just disappeared and no one has any record of. But the myths that we do have that can be traced back to a common origin will be this Pangean mythology. And then from there's a split. And this split will coincide with the time that the first humans started inhabiting the Eurasian landmass, basically, like migrating north up into Europe and up into parts of East Asia and Central Asia and stuff like that, and then expanding from there all through South Asia, again Southeast Asia, the North and South America, etc. So at that point you have the introduction of this, what he calls Laurasian mythology, and then there's a branching there. So the Laurasian is kind of like this new storyline that gets introduced, and then the continuation of the Pangean myths, which are preserved mostly, like I said, in Australia and sub-Saharan Africa. So the different elements of what he calls the Gondwana mythology, many of them can still be found incorporated into the Laurasian mythology. So this gets into the kind of the whole copying thing that I was mentioning at the beginning, kind of like a remix or just mixing it into a new creation. So the Gondwana mythology, these are some of the features. So earth, heaven, and the sea are pre-existent. So there's no origin mythology for these things. They're just there. They're the the ground, the pre-existing ground, and then everything develops, all the myths develop on top of that. So it's just taken for granted that the earth, heaven, and seas exist. And there is a high god in or moving towards heaven who sends down his son, and there's totems kind of like tribal and animal spirit type things and stuff like that. And then the focus of the creation focuses on the creation of humans, and humans are often created from a tree or from clay. And so we can see a carryover from that in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, for instance, of Adam being created from clay. Sorry, Adam. And then along this kind of proto-storyline, which is never actually in Gondwana myth, all these myths are kind of separated. He's just kind of putting them together and saying, well, there's a kind of storyline that can be made by putting all these myths together, and this is the storyline that he gives. So these humans who have been created then show hubris and are punished by a flood. The flood is actually a true human universal in mythology. Like, you can find flood myths everywhere, from sub-Saharan Africa, everywhere else. And then it's often a trickster deity or deities that bring culture to the humans. And then local tribes emerge. So that's kind of like the common shared features that can cohere in a type of like proto-narrative in the Gondwana mythology. Now, like I said, some of those carry over into the newly developed Laurasian mythology, which adds a whole bunch of stuff. So the Laurasian mythology is that there is an initial creation of everything, from nothing or from chaos. So now you can see this again in Genesis, where God creates everything from an initial chaos. And then there is Father Heaven and Mother Earth are created. Father Heaven then engenders two generations of gods. In the Greek mythology, these are the Titans and the Olympians. This is followed by 4 or 5 generations or ages, depending on the region. So there's, mostly 4, but some cultures have 5 generations or ages. Heaven is pushed up and the sun is released. The current gods defeat or kill their predecessors. There's the killing of a dragon, and there's a sacred drink. humans are introduced as the somatic or bodily descendants of the sun god. So humans aren't necessarily created from tree or clay, though they might be if that little mytheme got carried on. But more commonly, humans are like the direct descendants of a sun god. And then they too, like in the old mythology, show hubris. Or it might be a god that shows hubris, and are then also punished by a flood. And then also trickster deities bring culture, humans spread. This is often the emergence of nobles, like a kingly line. And then, only then, local history begins. And these are then followed by the final destruction of the world. Afterwards, a new heaven and earth emerge. So this is the first time, whereas previously kind of like history was viewed as kind of this eternal, like infinite series, I guess. Like there was always a heaven and earth, and everything just would go in the future. There was no expectation of like a final destruction. But all of a sudden, this whole storyline emerges with these, generations of gods and epochs of the creation, followed by the history of mankind, and then all leading up to and culminating in a final destruction, and then new creation. So this is the new element that was involved and which has influenced pretty much all Western and Eastern culture from then on, and which has even carried on, and not just that too, not just that, but even in nowadays you could even call it probably an almost universal thing, because that northern mythology has also gone like back into Africa. So along the North and East Africa, historically there was all kinds of trade and movement. So these myths have kind of spread over the last thousands of years all through Africa. The only reason you're able to find kind of these Gondwana cultures that have preserved more of a pure original mythology is that they were kind of like isolated. They didn't have a lot of like mixing or influence from the more northern influenced cultures. So you're able to find these kind of like holdovers of mythologies that were uninfluenced by the northern mythology. But then even the northern mythologies, like the spreading east, you have the population and the kind of the first settlers of Taiwan, and from Taiwan you get the peopling, the populating of the Pacific Islands, and so that kind of overlaid onto the original Papuans that were living there, and that spread even to Australia until today, when we have this global culture for the most part, where there's, except for like what are they called, the Sentinelese on the one Andaman island, who have like had zero contact with other humans. They're still pretty much like a hunter-gatherer tribe with no contact. And was it just a year or two ago, some researcher or something got killed trying to go and meet them. But for the most part, the just through contact and trade and movement and the internet now, it's kind of like this global thing where if we were to start today and move 1,000 years into the future, everything would be kind of mixed from this point on. But that's not how it has always been. One of the questions I have that I'm hoping to look into, once I finish the book, is to try to get an idea of how exactly this happened. Because one of the things from reading David Reich's book is that it seems like with all the different population migrations, that like the initial split, for instance, between Western Europeans and East Asians, is that it seems like there's been relative isolation, like between those two groups, for thousands and thousands of years. I'll have to look through the book again to get the details. This is something I want to get into, because it seems like reading his book, you get the impression that despite all the mixing that has occurred, you have this group of people that was living for thousands of years, and then this group, and then this group migrated over here, and that mixed the genes here, and then that group was like isolated for several thousand years, and then moved over here, and mixed with the people that were living there. But the impression I get from looking at his book is that all these things can kind of be traced, and that like if that region is Western Europe, for instance, all that's happening in almost complete and total isolation from what's happening like in East Asia. So what I want to really get into is see if it can be traced back to a point where you can say, okay, well, this is the region where the original like Laurasian mythology must have been from where all the groups moved over. Or if you can say that it was a bit later than that, but the reason it got into like East Asia, for instance, is from this migration of these people or this influence between these two cultures that you know, where you might have diffusion. I don't know if that's possible yet, because like he wrote this book and finished it just as ancient DNA was starting to be studied. So he wasn't able to use that. The genetics he uses in this is primarily Y chromosome DNA and mitochondrial DNA. And I think you can probably only go so far with that. What I'd be really interested to see is someone who has like expertise in those areas to kind of read this book and then use the latest ancient DNA research to see if it can be like correlated or like compared or tested against that new science. Because Witzel hypothesizes like a kind of South Asian origin, so maybe like northern India, maybe from where all these groups from where the original Laurasian mythology then spread, east and west and north. But I don't know if that's possible yet, which makes me think like if it isn't possible to find like one origin point like that, it makes me wonder if we might have to go in a more like diffusion hypothesis area, where maybe there was in some way, I don't know how, like a kind of like universal culture, kind of like we have today. Of course, there was no internet back then, but like apparently from the ancient DNA, like the genetics from vastly separated regions didn't mix very much. So I'm wondering how that might be possible. I think if he's right, then it must be possible in some way. But I think that's kind of where the research has to go from now on to basically kind of just either like confirm or refine his theory about the actual historical spread, basically.
Well, another thing that I found really interesting about the book, one particular myth that he talks about, a myth theme, I think you'd call it, is the idea of history progressing through different ages, and how it's. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was Laurasian, and it was a specifically Laurasian idea, a myth that, like with the Greeks, you had the golden age, and then whatever, platinum, silver, bronze, and then, but the interesting thing was he said that the Native Americans had a similar myth. At least some tribes had that same myth, and that that obviously dated back at least 20,000 years ago. When it's hypothesized that they populated the Americas, North America, but they had a very optimistic look on it. It didn't go from like gold to bronze. It went in the opposite direction. So it's really interesting to me that at some point in time that you can have these stories, and that they will remain for 20,000 years, the same basic structure, but that it can be completely inverted, so that at one point, if it is true that they did have a common origin, that it was one story, but then, for whatever reasons, whether it's due to just you found the new world basically, and now it's like you're super optimistic because things can only get better from here, and then versus the Greeks and the others who are just like life just keeps getting worse and worse and worse for us. Whatever reason it is that story it still keeps the same foundations, but then it becomes inverted. I don't know, did he talk about the meaning of that or anything in the later chapters of the book?
Not yet.
No.
I've still got like a chapter and a half left, so I haven't gotten to the one you mentioned. Like at the very last chapter is kind of his take on the the grand meaning of it all, and what the the meaning and purpose of these myths might be, but I haven't read that yet. So far, he's just kind of still making the case.
So I think then later in the, maybe next week's show, we should give the grand meaning. We need to go back, give everyone the grand meaning of all mythology.
Well, that's kind of the point of his of his book in a sense. I mean, he's saying human beings all have these very basic questions. Who are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? What is the meaning of all of this? And that's sort of the promise that he makes in attempting to go through this methodology of his to look at all these myths, to look at how they were spread through time, geographically, how they were changed, what their origins are, and it's maybe maybe this is the book or one of several parts of an answer to this point of time in humanity's history. Maybe he's onto something. That's certainly what I'm looking forward to finding out. Because if it's true that there are some mythomemes or clusters of mythologies that tell this grand story from beginning to end of humanity, from its birth to its destruction and everything in between, maybe there's a reason why these stories have lasted for as long as they have. Maybe they have, aside from tradition and ritual and the texts and the by mouth continuance of these stories, there's something so essential about them, something so truthful that's been lost in modern culture. Even though we have Jordan Peterson to go back at least a few thousand years in discussing biblical mythology, maybe these even more long-term mythologies say something even more deeply, or in addition to incredibly deep and profound statements of what our reality truly is. Maybe they've been around for so long for a reason.
Well, I want to read just an example of what he's talking about here. Now, first of all, I have to see if I can find out where this place actually is. Does anyone know where Togo is? Togo?
It's just down the road.
I think it might be... Well, I don't know. I'll just read. So this is a myth from the Basari people in Togo. Outside Laurasia and other African Andaman versions. Okay, so I'll just read this story from the Basari. It tells of Unumbote, high god and creator of beings. So Unumbote, God, made a human being. The man was Unele, man. Then Unumbote next made Opel, antelope. Then Unumbote made Uko, snake, named Snake. When these three were made, there were no other trees but one, Bubao, oil palm. At that time the earth had not yet been pounded smooth. Unumbote said to the three, "You must pound the ground where you are sitting." Unumbote gave them seeds of all kinds and said, "Plant these." Unumbote went away. Unumbote came back. He saw that the people had not yet pounded the ground, but had planted the seeds. One of the seeds had sprouted and grown. It was a tree that had grown tall and was bearing fruit. The fruits were red. Now, every 7 days, Unumbote returned and plucked one of the red fruits. One day Snake said, "We too would like to eat these fruits. Why must we be hungry?" Antelope said, "But we don't know this fruit." Then man and his wife, who had not been there at first, took some of the fruit and ate it. Then Unumbote came down from heaven. Unumbote asked, "Who ate the fruit?" Man and woman answered, "We ate it." Unumbote asked, "Who told you that you should eat of it?" Man and woman replied, "Snake told us." Unumbote asked, "Why did you listen to Snake?" Man and woman said, "We were hungry." Unumbote questioned Antelope, "Are you hungry too?" Antelope said, "Yes, I am hungry too. I'd like to eat grass." Since then, Antelope has lived in the bush, eating grass. Unumbote then gave Edi, sorghum, to man, yams and millet. And since the people have cultivated the land, and since then people have cultivated the land. But Snake was given by Unambote a medicine, a jojo, so that it would bite people. So then Witzel comments on this. It is remarkable that, differently from the Bible, this myth does not speak of a primordial guilt, or of an expulsion from paradise, or of a punishment of the snake. It merely assigns roles to the living beings and specifies the foods they will have to live on. The only punishment one can discern from this tale is of humans who have been victims of snake bites ever since, and presumably die. So when I first read that, I was thinking, oh wow, that's really Adam and Eve right there. Right down to the snake and eating of the fruit, and God saying, well, who told you could eat this stuff? And they say, oh, the snake told us. And this is from a culture that I'm guessing, given Witzel's kind of rigorous study, is not influenced at all by the biblical tale. Like, this is an original, ancient story that just happens to be something very common to the biblical story, which is all over the place. Like, he points out that this is a very common story of this primordial guilt. And there are even some other myths, like he says there's a Polynesian one. I couldn't find it in the book. I hadn't highlighted it. A Polynesian myth that basically says the same thing as the Adam and Eve story about the forbidden fruit in paradise. So this is a common story, but just reading that, just like when you actually read it like in print, it's like, oh wow, there are some really amazing correlations between, even a myth as recent as Adam and Eve, because relatively that is a recent myth. Now, just on that subject, I wanted to get to bring in a more specific example, like relating to the Bible. And this relates back to the whole thing about, thing I said in the intro about the constant remixing and copying of myths and structures and stories, because we haven't talked about it on Mind Matters yet, I don't think, but we did a Truth Perspective a few years ago with Russell Gmerkin on his book, Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, I believe was the name of it. And he makes a really good case for the Bible being not thousands of years old, 5,000 years old for the earliest parts, but being essentially like 2,300 years old. That the first edition of the Bible was basically written around 280, 300 BC in the Hellenistic era. So this is post-Alexander. And that any kind of, basically it was written with a goal in mind and written as a history, but at that point. So it wasn't like it's not like Moses wrote the first few books, and then 1,000 years later, bits and pieces got added on. He's arguing that it was written as a single book around this time, and all these parts were put together, maybe incorporating some older texts, but putting them, again, all into a new form, and there we have our Bible. And he argues that there are several sources for that Bible and several inspirations for that book, essentially, that overarching narrative, and that the writers of the Bible used the Library of Alexandria to essentially create their national myth, their national history, which was essentially a fiction, like a history that incorporated details from all kinds of other mythologies and histories that would have been available at the Library of Alexandria, and then distilled down and rewritten into this new form as the founding document for the new people of Israel, that would be reformed and reshaped with this document to create a new state, essentially, a new nation. And that in itself is kind of an example of this process of the kind of wholesale copying and borrowing and reincorporating of older and foreign stories into a new one that at the same time holds on to some more local traditions. So that's what Gmerkin argues too, is that there are some kind of distinctly Near Eastern, Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, more like Middle Eastern elements and laws that got incorporated into it, but primarily it is a Hellenistic document modeled on primarily Plato's laws, his second kind of utopian book after the Republic. So, and that he actually used that, or that they, like whoever wrote the Bible, actually used that as kind of like a template for composing this, this grand narrative with histories and songs and prophets and essentially plays too, if you consider the Book of Job. So that's just a kind of a specific specific example of this type of like copying and borrowing. And on top of that, inside of that, you've got who knows where the, all the details of the, Adam and Eve came from. I'm not sure about the, I haven't followed the latest research. If anyone has ideas for like, oh, they got that from this, or I don't know, it's possible. But that wherever they got it from, hypothetically, you can trace that back to like a common ancestor with this, this myth from Togo, or Todo, what was it, with Unumbote. So I just find that like really interesting. But also, so once you know that people do this, it makes the whole study of kind of ancient mythology that much more interesting, because, like I said, we've known, like being humans, we should know, and like we do know that this has happened throughout all human history. If you just look at like Virgil's Aeneid, he wrote that book as a Roman version of Homer's Odyssey. So basically, this Greek legend, Homer wrote this great epic poem, and then along comes Virgil and says, well, I can do him one better. I can like totally appropriate his storyline and make Aeneas the hero that totally outdoes Odysseus. And we'll have like this Roman version of like this Roman founder, Aeneas, and incorporate all the details from the Odyssey, and like so the overall plot structure and the scenes and all this stuff, and basically just use Aeneas as a stand-in for Odysseus, and create this new story. And then, like even today, like James Joyce, one of the most famous novels ever written, Ulysses, was used the Odyssey as basically a structure for his novel. And "O Brother, Where Art Thou" by the Coen brothers, same thing. That's what story writers have been doing to stories and with stories for the entire history of humanity. Like just shamelessly ripping off other stories, but at the same time making something like new and great at the same time, because it is different. Like the old stories can kind of get boring after a while, right? So you gotta reinvigorate them. But even when you reinvigorate them, like you guys were pointing out, they stay the same. Like it keeps the same structure, or it can at least. You can change the structure, but there's something about this particular structure that has stayed with humans for tens of thousands of years of tens of thousands of years of history, and of adding new elements and writing new stories. But at the same time, somehow that plot structure has been preserved to a greater or lesser degree all over the world, which is pretty amazing. So I think that the next grand development in human mythology should be to take this exact structure and write some new myths based on it, which will, like, given modern culture, it'll turn into like a blockbuster movie or something. But even that would be pretty cool, because you'd at least be getting some something that's withstood the test of time, as opposed to a lot of stuff that gets made today.
Well, what you said just made me think that for future shows, as we continue on this track, even beyond Witzel's book, that we can kind of look at some texts and see how they were reappropriating certain myths and stories for political and sociological and cultural control over a given set of people. That the intent behind recreating certain myths and reintroducing them into a culture could have, there could be ulterior motives behind it. And if so, what were those motives? What could they have been? Another point that I just kind of liked about Witzel's attitude towards all of this is, he's saying, follow me here. Listen to the approach I'm taking to going back in time and doing this comparative mythology. I haven't come up with a better method than than how to derive the significance of certain myths and the history of mythology. I don't think anyone else has. Here are the reasons. If you disagree, whether you're a linguist, an anthropologist, a mathematician, a biblical scholar, a psychologist, whatever your field of endeavor is, tell me what the criticism is, and we'll explore it and examine it together. Otherwise, these are my criticisms of all the approaches that have been taken towards looking at mythology in the kind of intellectual and academic sphere for the past few hundred years. And this is what I think is really one of the best approaches I can think of to examining all this. So I really like his attitude, and in distinction, to this other attitude where people look at a certain approach to mythology or a certain approach to text. Bible thumpers taking the New Testament perfectly literally. Orthodox Jews taking the Old Testament or even the Talmud, even more so, totally literally, and extrapolating all kinds of meanings that are convenient for their current ideology. And that's where it ends. That's the beginning and the end. And the trap is I think of people narrowing in on a particular way of looking at mythology or a particular mythology itself, and deciding that there is no other answer, there is no other perspective. So I think he's opening a lot of doors here, and it's a reason to delve into it.
Well, just given like you were saying, Harrison, about the role that myths have played, when you're talking about the creation of the Bible, the creation of a national identity, and the creation of, like when who is Virgil ripping off, Odysseus, so for that national identity. And when you're tracing it back, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, and if he's correct and there's an actual or one location, what it sounds like is it sounds like you're talking about two distinct political identities, between the Laurentian and the Gondwanan that were at the origins of human consciousness, human evolution, if you want to use that word, that there were two distinct political identities that existed thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. Whatever that looked like, and that just through people moving, just climate disasters, people traveling and different tribal identities developing, that they've just continued to elaborate on those basic original identities and just manipulated them for whatever purposes that suited their needs at the time, to explain their surroundings and whatnot. But that it has just over time, it's fractured, but it still retains a lot of the similar, foundation that it had, 40, 50, 60,000 years ago.
Well, any other points that you guys wanted to make on this? How are we doing for time? Hour? Okay. Well, I'll just briefly go over one other example. Like the main interesting thing that he's identified in here is that overall storyline, right? It's got like 12 points, I think, to it. But within each of those 12 points, you'll find variations. Like you pointed out the inversion of the four ages and how they went from like a kind of like entropic to a more creative and uplifting and hopeful attitude in certain other mythologies. So within any of the shared themes, you'll find new and kind of like revised takes on them, of course. New details added, but just within the overall structure. Kind of like with taking the Odyssey and just completely rewriting it to the point where it's almost unrecognizable, like in "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" Unless you're really paying attention, or unless you have a prior familiarity with the Odyssey, you might not even see the connection to it. But so the other interesting thing the other interesting angle is to look at the development of differences. He's primarily interested, I think, in finding the commonalities, but at the same time, of course, he has to look at all the differences. But I think it's within the differences that you can kind of go off in totally different directions, and just with a different goal in mind. So within these structures, you then look at how things change and the reasons behind them. So of course, like you said, Ilan, you can look at the political motivations, because a lot of the Roman adoption of Greek mythology, for instance, was for like explicitly political reasons, is to usurp Greece as the greatest place on earth, essentially, and the most powerful. And then if we telescope down even further into the last years of the Roman Republic and the first years of the empire, of the imperial system, then you'll see even more appropriation. So like Ovid and a lot of the like Roman poets and writers were writing explicitly for the purpose of promoting Augustus, for instance, as the first emperor, and taking all kinds of myths and religious ideas, and then associating them with Augustus in order to like raise him up as the god Augustus. And that was even going on with Pompey and Caesar in a less less extreme version, I'd say. So like Pompey and Caesar and Mark Antony were all kind of associating themselves with gods in such a way that was kind of new for Roman society. They were kind of experimenting with these associations with gods. Caesar, of course, kind of capitalizing on his descent from Venus as well as Aeneas, to have this kind of like royal and godly pedigree, but also associating himself with Romulus, the founder of Rome. And then once kind of the Romulan mythology was developed around the end of the Roman Republic, Augustus then totally appropriated that for himself to associate himself with Augustus, or to himself with Romulus, and it was all for these political purposes. It was like if we were to, well, if you look at a more humorous example, you look at like the kind of memes that portray Trump as kind of like this divine savior kind of thing, like or the like God Emperor Trump thing, like where you've got his face on like these massive like video game kind of badasses. Like it was the same kind of thing going on back then, but it was more serious back then. It would be today, it would be as if the White House like press corps or like PR department was creating these memes for themselves and being totally serious about them. Mm-hmm. Like that's what was going on in like the first years of in the years of the first Roman emperors, for instance. And so there's that. There's the political angle. There's the kind of the imitation of other cultures and other traditions as a means of kind of basking in their glory, but at the same time trying to usurp them, to do them again, to one up them. This was also what the early Christian writers did. So even though all this stuff was going on with the Roman emperors usurping all of these other like traditions and myths for themselves, then the Christians came along and said, well, we can do better than them. So they appropriated all of the same kind of myths and stuff to elevate Jesus above that. So they were essentially looking at all of the imperial propaganda and then applying that to Jesus in the Gospels. So it's like, well, Augustus and all of the emperors, they were they're presented as these godly beings, the rulers of the earth, the rulers of the cosmos, and so what the Christian writers did is just took all of those things, all of those names and like images and symbols and associations, and applied them to Jesus. And so now Jesus was bigger, better, more powerful than the Roman emperors. And so they're all like appropriating the same myths from each other and I'm better than you. No, I'm better than you. And in the process, we have these just amalgamations of all these different traditions and symbols and images that get put into this one character. So, and I think that's, even though Jordan Peterson doesn't talk about it, like he's not a great historian. I think he identified the kind of I don't know how you'd put it, just the spirit of the thing when he talks about like the character of Jesus Christ as this kind of like epitome and amalgam of like, you take all the greatest, all the traits of all the great heroes and you put them all into one, and then you get like this distillation of the heroic nature of someone, and then that's the character you've got, and you get that by that's the process that happens in the creation of any heroic character, like historically in any mythology, is that because all of those characters have been the distillations of all these other great ones. It's like, oh, I like that, that they've got something going with their, Odysseus. So I'm going to take that feature of Odysseus and add it with that feature of, Hercules or whatever, or any other character, and make this super, super divine, awesome being, and until you get like the amalgam and distillation of all of those features into one. And so it's just an interesting process to look at and think about.
Just as an aside, William Shakespeare said, "There's nothing new under the sun." Mm-hmm. And there have been folks who have said that even Shakespeare's writings weren't really totally original. He was drawing on a lot of stories and folk tales and ideas that were pre-existing. He was just an extraordinary talent and was able to put it together and popularize them for an audience that was ready to hear them in the way that he was ready to present. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, well, and Shakespeare, like his play on Julius Caesar was, he used as his inspiration Plutarch's biography of Caesar, I believe. And then it's the same thing today with movie scripts and novels. It's like whenever there's an adaptation of a novel into a movie, it's the same process going on. Like anyone who adapts, whether it's a previous version of the same movie or a novel or a TV show or a video game, it's like they're trying to, in the process, they're trying to make something better of it. Depending on the source material, they often, they might fail horribly, like pretty much every video game adaptation that's been made into a movie. But sometimes it might just be a fault of the medium. I don't know, but rarely, but sometimes you get a movie version that's better than the book. For instance, it's rare, but it happens every once in a while. And then you get and then it works the other way too, like with novelizations of films. It's like I for some reason I was thinking about it recently, just how weird it is. Like it seemed weird to me to make a novelization of a film. So then I did a little research to see if they're still doing it, because I know like it was big. I don't know when it started really. I think when I was researching it, it's actually been around for a long time. And like in the 70s and the 80s, I remember, and in the 90s, there'd be novelizations. Anytime a movie would come out, there'd be a novelization of it, whether it was like a superhero movie or like a horror or a sci-fi movie. If it wasn't originally a book, they'd pay someone to do a novelization of it. Like the Star Wars movies, for instance, it's like they were movies first, but books came out very soon afterwards, to the point where they became pretty popular in themselves. So I was reading an article about novelizations with one of the big authors. I think he might have been the guy that did one of the Star Wars adaptations, but he was giving his perspective on it, and he scene or process as being one that's actually very creative and very good, because he can watch a movie because movie scripts are what, average 90 pages or something, 100 pages, I think it's around there. And that's when you look at a movie script, it's mostly blank page. You've got dialogue and little bits of scene settings and stuff like that. And when you actually novelize that, he was saying, it's like you get the chance to, first of all, change all the parts you think are bad, and add characters in and add all kinds of stuff in to make an actual good story out of it. Especially if you're doing a movie that you've been paid to write a novel for that you don't really like. Well, for him, he could actually make it into something that he would enjoy reading. So it works in all directions, and so sometimes you might get a novelization that's better than the movie, which is also kind of weird, because those things are just sold to be, just made to. Well, I was going to say they're made to be sold in airports, but again, reading this article, apparently there's actually a readership for novelizations. People that they were describing, it's like people who like the movie and are fans of the movie will actually want to re-experience that, that feeling of watching the movie, but without necessarily watching the movie. They want more material, basically, so they'll read the novel too. And
what was it? 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick, based on a short story by Arthur C. Clarke. And then after the film was made, Arthur C. Clarke actually made it into this great sci-fi novel that it became.
I don't know if it was based on a short story at first, but it's a common it's a common myth that the movie was based on the book. Actually, the movie and the book were worked on at the same time, in collaboration with Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke. So I'm not sure if there was a short story first, but they were working on both of them at the same time, and so I think, I can't remember if the book got published shortly after the movie or around the same time, but it was actually a collaboration between both of them. So Clarke kind of did his own thing with the book to a certain extent, and then Kubrick did his own thing with the movie to another extent. And they've got the same kind of, again, the same structure, the same kind of overall thing going on, but they're very different in other ways, because Kubrick was kind of notorious for that, for using the plot line essentially of his script, of his story, which often came from another source. I'm pretty sure most of the stuff that he worked on was a novel or a screenplay already written. Dr. Strangelove was a novel beforehand. 2001 was developed concurrently with Arthur C. Clarke's novel, and The
Shining.
The Shining was a novel. Eyes Wide Shut was a novella. But he'd take that and then essentially use that structure to say something completely different, on another symbolic level. And that's, he said, in interviews, that's actually what he was doing. Kind of like David Lynch, he very rarely would give a hint of what he was actually trying to do with the movie and what the story he was actually telling. But if you so that's another thing, is the use of a plot structure as only the skeleton to hold a second layer narrative that you're talking about. That would be an allegorical way of writing. So there are allegorical interpretations of the Bible, for instance, where it's you've got your surface words that you're looking at, your surface narrative, but that there's a hidden meaning behind the words. So I wonder how that would all work out with this mythology stuff. I don't know. Maybe something to consider. But with that said, I think we've been rambling on for too long today. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.